вот СВО закончится, чем мы будем заниматься? То есть они настолько увлеклись этим.
$190 billion. And over 500,000 new jobs. That is the price tag of the economic juggernaut Russia has built, a machine that is now fatally dangerous to shut down. In 2025 alone, the country's defense spending hit nearly 90% of Ukraine's entire economic output. Factories scaled up, banks handed out billions against future government contracts, and millions of people tied their paychecks directly or indirectly to defense production. It seems deeply paradoxical when politicians casually joke about returning to peacetime, while the national economy is barreling off a cliff with no brakes. But what actually happens if the war ends tomorrow? Who will foot the multi-billion-dollar bill for facilities built exclusively to pump out missiles and artillery shells? What happens to the Rust Belt towns where a single defense plant is the sole beating heart of the local economy? And why could a sudden peace treaty instantly turn today's industrial boom into a catastrophic banking meltdown? This episode breaks down Russia's ultimate economic trap, why dragging out the war is ruinous, but a rapid pivot to peace will inevitably trigger a brutal domino effect. Grab some tea, get comfortable, and let's get started. To grasp why Russia will struggle so much to pivot back to a normal civilian economy, one must realize the sheer scale of the post-2022 shift. The government didn't just bump up defense spending, it became the ultimate monopoly buyer for entire industries. Consider this. By 2025, according to SIPRI estimates, roughly 16 trillion rubles had been poured into the war effort and the defense sector. That is 7.5% of Russia's entire GDP. To put that in perspective, this figure roughly matches the annual size of Ukraine's whole economy. And this massive tsunami of state cash didn't just flood the facilities assembling tanks and rockets. It washed over steelmakers, chemical plants, heavy machinery producers, logistics networks, construction firms, and thousands of smaller subcontractors. Take a typical industrial town, for example. Until recently, the local plant was quietly rusting away, wages were miserable, and the youth were leaving at the first opportunity. Suddenly, a war kicks off. Enter a buyer with bottomless pockets, the government. The factory lands highly lucrative military contracts, switches to 24/7 shifts, and starts vacuuming up labor from the surrounding areas. Blue-collar workers, suddenly flush with cash, snap up real estate, take out car loans, and spend freely at malls and restaurants. The local small business scene blows up overnight to cater to them. Fast forward a couple of years, and the whole town is hopelessly hooked on this cash drip. Now, it's not just the factory relying on the defense sector, absolutely everyone depends on it. According to the UK's RUSI Institute, this state contract meat grinder has pulled in over 4.5 million workers nationwide. And this is exactly where the trap snaps shut. For cabinet ministers sitting in Moscow, slashing defense orders after a peace deal is just logical budget optimization. But for a town like this, it is a flat line. The plant will stop, contractors will go bust, and the local service economy will pop like a soap bubble. Incomes will vanish. Yet those massive mortgages people took out, those are not going anywhere. Of course, the entire country isn't universally thriving on this military money. But looking at this chart perfectly captures how Russian industry has split into two parallel realities. The economy has become grotesquely skewed. One half is completely jacked on government steroids, while the other is suffocating under crushing interest rates, severe labor shortages, and insanely expensive raw materials. This is precisely where the wartime stimulus morphs into a fatal addiction. As long as the government keeps paying, the machines keep humming, people receive salaries, and regional officials report record-high employment. The longer this drags on, the more businesses and ordinary families bet their entire futures on the illusion that this cash flow will never dry up. But there is a catch. Expanding a factory using just the revenue already earned is rarely possible. To break ground on a new facility, buy heavy machinery, and hire staff immediately, companies need capital well before the government actually settles the invoice. And this is the exact moment banks enter the wartime economy, transforming the promise of future budget orders into cold, hard cash today. But here is the vulnerability. Even that government money doesn't just magically drop into corporate accounts overnight. The state essentially says, build this order. Here is the contract. But the main payout comes later. The government can pay in tranches as milestones are hit or upon final delivery. Meanwhile, the factory needs steel today. It needs electronics today. Payroll and construction bills are due today. This creates a massive cash flow black hole between the promise of budget money and actual production. And who plugs that gap? Exactly, the banks. Picture a scenario. A plant secures a 100 billion ruble contract. To fire up the assembly line right now, management goes to a bank and borrows 70 billion. They scale up, fully expecting to clear the loan with future state payouts. This is where the financial smoke and mirrors begin. On paper, in pristine financial reports, it looks like standard, healthy corporate debt. It appears as though a successful, standalone factory owes those billions, not the federal budget. In reality, that enterprise's ability to pay back a single dime is 100% tethered to whether the government keeps funding the party. This setup is not a random improvisation. In February 2022, a tiny but critical tweak was made to the state defense order laws. Authorized banks were mandated to issue subsidized loans to defense contractors. The system was forced to run on leverage. As long as state orders keep growing and invoices clear on time, the whole structure looks rock solid. The plant expands, workers are paid, the bank books its interest, bad debt essentially does not exist. Yet, simultaneously, a long-term noose is tightening around the economy's neck. Enterprises are locking themselves into multi-year debt traps, even though their entire income relies on a single buyer. When a standard civilian company loses demand, it can pivot to new markets, change its product line, or run a fire sale. But who exactly buys highly specialized artillery components or military radar systems if the Ministry of Defense says stop? There are simply zero alternatives. This is exactly how a temporary spike in military output mutates into a long-term debt time bomb. The budget orders hardware today, while bank loans push the actual cost of that expansion deep into the future. As long as the military cash pipeline stays open, this debt is manageable. But if that flow suddenly shuts off, the fallout will detonate simultaneously on the factory floors, in the dependent company towns, and across the bank's balance sheets. Now fast forward to day X. The government signs a peace treaty, or the conflict simply freezes. Defense budgets are inevitably slashed. An official notice from the Ministry of Defense lands on the desk of a massive factory CEO. Thanks for the work, guys. We don't need tanks and shells in these volumes anymore. No more contracts. In that exact second, the first domino violently hits the table. The CEO opens the financials and practically turns gray on the spot. Budget money is gone, with no prospects of returning. But that 70 billion loan taken out to build new state-ordered production lines, that remains untouched. The interest meter is running every single day. To survive, the enterprise begins brutally cutting costs. First, the plant axes vendor purchases. Overnight, suppliers of steel, components, electronics, chemicals, and hardware lose their primary client. Next, the factory starts laying off staff or dropping them to minimum wage. That same worker who was raking in huge money on defense yesterday, who locked in a mortgage, financed a car, and bought appliances, sees his income crater, but his monthly bank payments remain exactly the same. The local retail scene, cafes, and service sectors see their foot traffic vanish instantly. Like a virus, the fallout from a single canceled government order paralyzes the entire regional economy. The ultimate threat, however, triggers when the factory giant itself fails to service its multi-billion-dollar bank debt. For the bank, this means creating reserves, literally locking away its own capital to cover the toxic loan. As more enterprises face this crisis simultaneously, the banking sector's profits and capital are gutted. This is where the contagion breaches the containment zone of the defense industry. To preserve their safety margins, banks slam the brakes on issuing new credit. Consequently, a totally normal, peacetime civilian company cannot secure a loan for a new machine, warehouse, or business expansion, despite having zero ties to military contracts. The entire civilian economy begins choking from capital starvation. Naturally, this won't necessarily trigger a classic Hollywood-style banking collapse. In Russia, major banks are structurally fused with the state, and in the event of a meltdown, the government will simply inject fresh capital. The state might even throw the factory a dummy contract to build anything at all, just to keep the debt serviced and prevent street protests. But realistically speaking, this kind of bailout does not erase the loss. It merely shifts the burden of who pays for it. Initially, the toxic debt was on the factory's books. Then, the headache passed to the bank. After state intervention, it lands squarely on the federal budget. Ultimately, that cost will be smeared across the entire population through tax hikes, inflation, a crashed ruble, or slashed funding for schools and hospitals. The chain reaction is bulletproof. The state cuts orders, the factory loses revenue, vendors and workers are left penniless, loans turn toxic, banks cut off credit, the entire civilian economy stalls. At first glance, someone might argue, the solution is simple. If ammo is no longer needed, just pivot the factories to peacetime mode. Let them build tractors, trains, cars, or MRI machines. Spoiler alert, that is not how reality works. A military plant cannot be retooled by a single executive order. Its CNC machines, testing rigs, personnel, and supply chains are hyper-optimized for highly specific, classified products. Supplying the civilian market requires completely different components, standards, and infrastructure. Western economists are increasingly sounding the alarm on this exact structural flaw. The Bank of Finland's BOFIT Institute notes that Russia is firmly locking into a two-track economy. Enterprises servicing defense orders receive uninterrupted access to manpower, capital, and investments. Meanwhile, private civilian businesses are suffocating from brutal interest rates, sluggish demand, and a critical collapse in growth opportunities. The longer this divide persists, the harder it will be to route resources back into the civilian sector. Economist Alexandra Prokopenko from the Carnegie Russia-Eurasia Center formulates this diagnosis even more bluntly. The structural mutations that occurred during the war are practically impossible to reverse without a deep new crisis. However, it is crucial not to fall into the opposite extreme. According to SIPRI estimates, Russia's military spending reached approximately 16 trillion rubles in 2025, equivalent to around 7.5% of GDP. The country finds itself in a complex, paradoxical deadlock. One cannot simply claim that war is economically profitable, while peace is unprofitable. The trap is engineered differently. Prolonging the militarized model systematically drains the civilian economy, bleeding it of all its reserves. Yet, any attempt to rapidly halt this machine will trigger a massive and highly agonizing recession. Fighting an endless conflict is not a way out. It does not resolve the fundamental economic rot. It merely inflates a structural bubble, shifting the fallout into the future. Every additional month the economy runs in the red line zone simply delays the inevitable finale, ensuring that the economic withdrawal symptoms, when the engine finally stops, will be even more severe and devastating. The fascinating part is that breaking the rules and pumping the system full of cash is not exclusively a wartime phenomenon. Erdogan attempted to run this exact same experiment in a completely peacetime environment, and it nearly destroyed Turkey. To see the consequences of that policy, check out this video right here. Sound off in the comments. Do you think there is even a single painless exit from this trap, or is a total collapse already locked in? If you found this breakdown valuable, support it with a like and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss new videos. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.